This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to a researcher from Ecuador named Francis. She doesn't want to say her full name for reasons which are understandable, because right now in the country there are very serious clashes. The government is cracking down hard on protesters who are essentially fighting for a better future for Ecuador. It's been reported as a fuel thing, but there's a lot more to it than that. We're going to go over it in detail. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us at patreon.com/popularfront. We need all the help we can get right now. We're being censored on every single platform. It's a fucking nightmare, but yeah. To start with, before we go into where this has come from, why these clashes are happening, maybe just explain to us what is actually happening right now in Ecuador.
So beginning on June 13th was the beginning of the start of a paro nacional. It was called by CONEAI, which is the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador. It's kind of an umbrella corporate organization that has a bunch of constituent organizations underneath it. There are other sectors that are involved as well, including educators, transistos, the banana industry. It's really not just the indigenous CONEAI organization. It really is a cross-sector protest. So the protest was called 9 days before it actually began. So everybody had plenty of time to know what was coming. There was a very large paro that happened in October 2019. So many people were aware of the direction this could take and were able to, prepare. But there has been ongoing conversation with the Ecuadorian government. The current sitting president is Guillermo Lasso. He's been in office since May of 2021. So he's been in office just a little over a year. There are 10 very distinct points that CONEAI is trying to get the government to compromise on them, particularly around the recession that was made worse by the pandemic, understandably. And we may get into those 10 points a little bit later, but they've basically been in writing in front of the government since last August. And there's been 6 different opportunities since August 2021 for the government to kind of cool things down with CONEAI and with these other different sectors. There's over 53 organizations involved in the protest. And the government decided to not meet them halfway, so the protests kind of began.
In the West, we've only just started to see any real reporting kind of surface. Yeah, and I think that's because the violence, of how bad it is. I think more than one person has died now, right? And there's that horrible footage of one of the protesters with the tear gas grenade lodged in his head. I know the police said, he died because he handled a bomb, and it's no, it's clear evidence that it was the tear gas grenade was stuck in his brain. He's dead. I've seen the brain scans as well, actually. You guys showed me. So yeah, well, maybe explain to us what is that like on the ground there? What form of the protest taking? Sure.
So a very, very common form of protest in Ecuador, regardless of it being on this scale or not, are roadblocks. So there's 4 regions within Ecuador. There's the Galapagos, which is way out in the middle of the ocean. There's the Costa, there's the Sierra, which is in the middle of the Andes, and then there's also the Amazon. So due to the kind of geographic diversity of the country, there's obviously infrastructure issues, right? So a roadblock can completely cut off a city that houses millions very effectively, because there are only so many roads into and out of a city on the coast, in the Andes, or in the Amazon, understandably. It's very common to burn tires here, not necessarily even just as a form of protest, but that's a way that the roadblocks are commonly done. Oftentimes, too, people will just take shrub or brush from the side of the road and use that as the kind of roadblock, or just as, kind of body blocks there as well. Because most roads are maybe 4 lanes, right? Unless you're in Guayaquil or Quito, which are the 2 largest cities. Quito being the capital. So it really just began with roadblocks. I will say too, like the roadblocks are so that cars cannot pass. You can pass on foot. A lot of campesinos and just the average worker in Ecuador is walking on foot to bus stop anyway. Like you could still get to work and everything for the first week. It was inconvenient because you would have to take a bus to a certain point, just walk across the line and then pick up a bus or cab on the other side, right? And there are also humanitarian corridors called by CONAI, by this organization, to ensure that ambulances can pass and that type of thing. Some of the roadblocks are more flexible than others, right? Like ones that we've had to cross on foot have been completely understanding, though we have good relationships with the communas. But in some areas, it's absolutely no pass, right? And that's really how it started. And then just a few days into the protest, the president of CONAI, Leonidas Isa, was actually arrested. It's debated in the media whether or not this was, a legal arrest or not, right? But it definitely poured fuel on the fire, understandably. And so he was arrested and then kind of not disappeared, but the government was not clear about where he was being held. And then he was ultimately released. And at this point, they had kind of, my interpretation is the hope was that this was going to take away some of his power or, some of the momentum of the movement. But instead, they really said, we're not stopping because of this. It's not the first attempt to kind of stop this leader, Isa. He's been the president of CONAI since June 2021. So he became president of CONAI about 3 months after Lasso took office. So they're both relatively young leaders in their tenure. And so at the very beginning of the Paro, a lot of people started walking on foot from the Amazon in the east towards Quito. Quito is the capital, is the legislative seat of Ecuador. So that's really where the protests are generally centered. That's where the government is. And so that's, it's like going to DC in the US, right? So people started, it was going to take time for a lot of these indigenous communities and campesinos to make it on foot. All the way over to the capital. So then after Isa was released, he said he was captured right outside of Quito in the Cotopaxi area. And he said, okay, well, I'm going to go to Quito now because of this. And so everybody who hadn't been converging on Quito has, made that the epicenter now. Things began escalating on a pretty small scale, mostly just in the larger cities. There were some university-sponsored protests in Cuenca. Cuenca is considered the Athens of Ecuador. It's a big cultural heritage city, beautiful Spanish colonial architecture, that type of thing. It's a little bit more calm and peaceful and conservative. But even there were university students that were being chased down into these rivers by police over the side of very rocky riverbeds and stuff very, very early on in the protests.
Is this when, so I was reading that somebody, quote unquote, fell off a ravine?
Yes, so that followed shortly. So Cuenca, there were no actual injuries, thank goodness, in the process. But just outside Quito in the sector called Guaylabamba, there were 5 young men, particularly anti-mining activists, as I understand it, that were being chased by police in full riot gear. To be very clear, all the police have been in full riot gear since day one. And tear gas was being thrown at them, and they were run off of a cliff and a ravine. And unfortunately, one young man, his name has not been released in the press, I believe, because of age. And he died, and 4 others are in critical condition. It's unclear if they stabilized or not. But that was considered an accident, right? It was an indirect consequence of their perceived fear of the police chasing them. And that was just outside Quito again. Now, the instance you were talking about with the tear gas followed. It occurred on very late on the evening of June the 21st. So, we're a week into the protest. We had our first accidental death, and then there was a death with less plausible deniability. His name was Byron Guido Watatuka. He is a Quechua man from Puyo, which is in Pastaza province in the Amazon. At this point, the police and government are saying that they really have not been using force, even denying using less than lethal weapons. And there is footage and subsequent tomography looking at the impact, but it was, I don't even know how. I mean, it was very, very short range, but it's absolutely, the tear gas canister was lodged in his head and still.
This whole, I hate this term of less lethal. I mean, if you throw a brick at a police officer, they're not going to consider that less lethal. But if they fire something that literally uses gunpowder to disperse this small rocket at someone's head, that for them is then considered less lethal. It's outrageous.
Right, exactly. I think anybody who's followed protests anywhere in the world knows the hypocrisy of less than lethal. Yeah. I mean, even rubber bullets, if you're not using within the very, very specific confines in which you're supposed to use those weapons, anything can become lethal very quickly, or cause catastrophic injury, at best. So he was the first real kind of lack of deniability about it. And Amnesty International actually made a statement about it yesterday, saying that their analysis says that this was an excessive use of force, and have asked Fiscalia, which is the kind of Justice Department in Ecuador, to investigate whether it was an extrajudicial death now. And in response, the Minister of the Interior last night, Patricio Carrillo, said that the opinion of human rights organizations does not matter, in response to their statement that this was a result of police force. Since that time, the number of deaths that have occurred has increased. The majority of them are occurring in Quito. There were 2 additional deaths confirmed yesterday by the Ministry of Interior. The CONII has said that the death count is at 5. The Ministry of Interior has said that the count is currently at 4. Organizers say that it's at least 7, but there are 5 that are quote unquote confirmed, 4 by the government itself even. The 2 that occurred on the 24th, one man, Henry Quezada, was killed with a pellet weapon at close range and was unable to be resuscitated. And the other death was in San Antonio de Pichincha, also in the Quito area. But I'm unsure of the exact munitions that were the cause of that particular death. This morning, a 5th name was added to the list. But I'm again there. It's unclear. That one hasn't been acknowledged by the Ministry of the Interior to really understand what the cause was there. But there have been horrific injuries as well, not just in Quito, but in particular in the Amazon as well. Pastaza province has been quite bad. When Byron was killed with that tear gas canister in Puyo, the protesters then took the police station and burned a lot of property and patrol cars to the ground as a result. It's the rhetoric of the protest here is not that different than anything you would have seen during George Floyd or during protests in general, right? The government claims that they're delinquents and terrorists. They claim that there's bad actors within the protesters, even if they consider their protesters good. The protesters claim that there's infiltrators and undercover cops that are there. I think I shared with you yesterday that there were some video of plainclothes cops making civilian arrests in El Obralito in the park in Quito, where one of the protests is focused. So I think that there's some validity to the claim on the protester side about having a plainclothes police presence there. But it's the rhetoric comes from both sides. There's it's hard to tell what's up and down, but it's really important to note, like I said earlier, it's not just the indigenous communities that are out. The evangelical indigenous community is out. There are old Jesuit grandmothers who are marching in front of Shuar women in traditional dress. There are children that are out. It's across sectors, across demographics, across age. And by and large, aside from opportunists taking advantage and looting, or the direct action response from a civilian that was killed by police force and the consequence of the police station being destroyed in that particular city, it has been widely peaceful until the last 4 days.
We've obviously just kind of gone over it, but in a nutshell, like, what is it the protesters are actually asking for?
Sure. Okay, so it's 10 very clearly delineated points. I'll try to go through them quickly. If you've seen any media coverage about it, people really are fixated on this first point about petroleum, about gas, right? It is a major export. It's the top export for Ecuador. In 2020, it's 4.94 billion is, the amount of GDP that's produced by petroleum exports in Ecuador. So the first is a reduction of fuel cost and expansion of the fuel subsidies and no additional rise in the cost. This is not across all grades of gas, but in particular diesel and what's called ecopaís or extra here, 85 octane. It's what's used by the majority of people by and large. There's been subsidies that were reinstated in October of 2021 that kept that at $2.55 per gallon, and they're asking for it to go down to $2.10 per gallon. The second request is a 1-year moratorium on current debt repayment, a suspension of interest for small-scale loans, in particular for campesinos and small-scale debtors. There's also an ask for fair prices on farm products. The banana industry is Ecuador is the largest contributor to banana exports in the world. It's 3.83 billion a year, but partially due to supply chain issues and in part due to the Ukrainian conflict, the banana has been devalued substantially. A lot of shipments and contracts were canceled, and it's having a huge impact. And they have been asking the government to ensure at least a basic price so that they can pay their farm workers, even if they can't turn a profit on the banana exports this year. So that's the third price, the third point they're asking for. The fourth point is about employment and labor rights. Only 32% of Ecuadorians have a stable job. The monthly universal basic income is $425 in Ecuador, but the price parity basket for the cost of living for an individual is $625 a month. So you can see that even with the universal basic income, which many people do not even get, with inflation, it's just not keeping up. That's not a uniquely Ecuadorian problem, as we all know, but it is something that they're standing for.
So these are cost of living protests, essentially.
Yeah. So for the most part, so far, that's what they are. The fifth point is no extractivism in indigenous lands or waters, in line with the constitutional rights. The sixth point is just the respect for the actual constitutional rights that were set in place in 2008. There are some interesting ones in Ecuador. In particular, there is a constitutional right to protest. There's a constitutional right to reporting and journalism. And the really interesting one is there's actually a constitutional right to nature in Ecuador. Mm-hmm. So anytime that the president or organizations expand extractivism, they're technically violating a constitutional right in that regard if it has an impact on nature. The seventh point is to prevent privatization of certain sectors. Right now, basically, they're equivalent of what we would probably call Medicare in the US. The IESS medical system is collapsing. Cancer care was almost completely shut down for the country because they owed so much money in debt to the cancer providers within the kind of Medicare network. There is no medicine within the hospitals, even pharmacies. You have a hard time finding medicines. If you have to go to the hospital for a surgery, it's on your family to go pick up blood from blood banks and to go purchase and stand in line and try and find a pharmacy for the medicines you need for your surgery. So they're asking that this not be privatized and turned into something more akin to the American healthcare system, but is rather supported in the way it's supposed to be by the government. The final 3 points I'll try to make quick. Wanting to set price controls on and prevent price speculation, just overinflation due to supply chain issues. The price of bread has doubled recently. 40% of Ecuadorians live on one meal or less a day. So when the cost of a roll goes from 10 cents to 20 cents, you're maybe starting to look at half a meal a day, right? They need, in relation to the privatization, there needs support for the health and education system. There's been protests in recent months. The medical students in Azuay province, where Cuenca is, showed up for class, and there were no teachers and no classrooms assigned or anything for them. So they can't even train the next generation of doctors to replace those that were killed during the pandemic. And then in general, the most important one, I think, that is super important to highlight is the insecurity in Ecuador. They're asking for just a chance to live not in fear. One of the few stories about Ecuador that has come out in the last year has been around the increasingly violent prison riots that have been occurring in the last 48 months. So far in 2022, over 300 individuals at least have died within prison custody. The prisons are incredibly overcrowded, but gang and narco kind of turf wars have reached an absolute boiling point. It was so bad in the littoral prison in Guayaquil that they aren't even able to identify a number of the bodies of the individuals who died because of beheadings and things like that. It's getting to, the type of things that you see in Hollywood, right? Bodies hanging from bridges coming out of Guayaquil. A friend of mine was killed in broad daylight in San Borondon, the richest neighborhood within Guayaquil, at a gastronomy pub, just sitting there with his fiance a little over a month ago. So the insecurity is completely out of control. They're trying to spread out the gangsters into different prisons across the country, and people are escaping. Weapons are being dropped with drones into prisons. I think that this is really the point that the majority of the sectors are on board with, right? Because the insecurity in Ecuador is really what has, besides the pandemic, been grinding the economy to a halt. And there is absolute consensus on this point that there has to be stronger security for the Ecuadorian people. So when you read about it from other people, they say it's a gas war. This is not just about gas. It is about the future for these individuals and about what needs to happen now for children and civilians to stop dying.
And in terms of the response from the government, we know that's been very heavy-handed. Has there been any signs that they might, talk to the protesters, try and fix something, or is it all just these people are terrorists, get rid of them?
So it started on the 13th. On the 19th, there was actually a partial response from the government. They said they're going to double the intercultural education budget. They set in place a 50% subsidy on fertilizer, one particular type of fertilizer. They increased the human development budget bonus for individual families to $55. If you have a current loan that's under $3,000, then they cut the interest rate in half from 10% to 5%. And they canceled a number of loans for families and small businesses and providers under $3,000. But the response from the protesters and in response to those actions has been that these are partial measures. You're still not even talking to us about insecurity or about gas, which enables us to work, or about our constitutional rights. So they said, we really appreciate that, but this is why the paro will continue. We've asked for those things for going on a year now, and it took a paro to even get those half responses. So the paro will not continue with a half response here. There have been back and forth about whether or not they will have a dialogue. CONEI's President Issa said that I am happy for a dialogue, but it needs to be in public because the last times they have spoken have been behind closed doors, and what was agreed to behind closed doors was not what was then enacted. Most recently, there was one point where Lasso decided to take the Casa de Cultura in Quito. Think of it kind of like a Smithsonian, National Archives, and public gathering space all in one, right? And they took the Casa de Cultura, the military did, saying that there were quote unquote war materials there. I guess if you consider books war materials, then that's true. And so now CONEI has said that for negotiations to continue, the Casa de Cultura needs to be demilitarized. The people were allowed back in 2 days ago, but then as of last night, when CONEI was there meeting and strategizing and holding a rally, tear gas was deployed and the Casa de Cultura was taken back by the military yesterday. So at this point, I don't see how the negotiations will continue when there was a very clear line in the sand that the Casa de Cultura needed to remain demilitarized for negotiations to continue.
Right, and we have seen in the protest, there's like a hardcore of people that are fighting back. They've got makeshift shields. Right. It's their right to, in my opinion, to defend themselves. Who are they? Are they like a group specifically? Do you see more of that activity? Like generally when, from what I've noticed in reporting and being on the ground for these things, when protesters start dying, certain groups kind of coalesce and form, more hardcore groups, frontliners, if you like. Are we seeing that happening yet?
I think it is. I don't know that it's a particular identity group or subsect of CONEI that is kind of reaching that level of escalation. I will say to somebody who's not familiar with Latin America, or in particular with like Ecuadorian cultural traditions, some of the imagery can be quite disturbing, not just the tire fires, but the way that people are armed. But the majority of people who are armed are with their traditional spears or weapons. It's more of a cultural identity expression than using spears. It's also incredibly difficult to obtain guns in Ecuador as a citizen. Really? So yeah, I can tell you more about that, but I don't want to bog it down. It's a huge two-stage process. You have to go to the judicial police and to the military. You have to have a mental exam. You have to wait 30 days. You have to have proof of purchase. You can only have 2 guns. It can only be a 38. You can't transit with it loaded. Even if you're transiting a gun unloaded, you can only have 5 bullets. You actually have to go through ballistics test at a military installation to be able to be issued a permit for a gun. So the protesters are not armed. It's incredibly, incredibly difficult to be armed with a gun. Do they have traditional spears in line with some of their indigenous communities? Yes. Are those even being used as weapons versus being ceremonial cultural identity? Not that I'm seeing.
Right. So what do you think is going to happen next?
Well, things are getting pretty rough for the average person. Counter protesters started about 4 or 5 days ago. It's not going to resolve anytime soon, as I see it. There are people and human rights organizations calling for continued discussion. Lasso and his government keep saying that they will come to dialogue and then have not. Now Lasso has tested positive for COVID, which is going to continue to stall out negotiations. Though they really don't. We live in a pandemic world. Like, it doesn't have to be fully in person. Like, we've solved some of those problems, but those negotiations have been stalled with that as a reason, legitimate or not. I think it's going to continue to get worse. Groceries started running out of fresh produce and things about a week ago. There's no access to gas canisters for heat in homes. For a little while, you were able to take like an empty canister for your stove and for your water heater to a distributor and get it refilled, but that's even stopped too. People are running out of food. There aren't really even options to buy more food now. And transit is completely at a standstill. You can't get from city to city. Those roadblocks are still there. Walking on foot is not necessarily a safe option at the majority of those roadblocks now. I think things are going to get worse before they get better.
Right, and this didn't just start with this, right? This has been going on for a while. There was a real serious clashes, kind of similar, I guess, in 2019. Maybe go back a bit if you can and explain, it seems that Ecuador has a healthy protest movement.
Yes, they absolutely do. And like I mentioned earlier, there's constitutional right to protest here and in Ecuador. In 2019, they were protesting austerity measures. Ecuador was actually in recession before the pandemic, unfortunately. Then in 2019, they were also very much calling for the then president, Lenin Moreno, to resign. And they were also at that time protesting that they wanted the reinstitution of fuel subsidies, which are in effect in part, just not to the extent that they want them to be. The result of those protests were that some of those austerity measures were ended. Moreno was not ousted, and the fuel subsidies, it took more time for those to really come back to being set. That was really until October of the next year that the fuel subsidies finally were put in place. But that protest occurred from the 3rd of October to the 14th of October. It was 12 days in full. There was a civilian death a little bit earlier in the protest, maybe by a day or two, that really escalated things. But today is day 13, and we're nowhere near a resolution. And as bad as the October 2019 protests were, we're actually already been going on longer than it was then.
Right. And that was highly successful, right?
Yeah, I think people viewed it as extremely highly successful. The overall death toll was not hugely substantial. There was tons and tons and tons of people injured, but things were resolved and it was back to normal. Tourism was completely back to its standard pre-pandemic, this was pre-pandemic, but back to its standard levels within just a month or two. All of the embassy calls to avoid Ecuador were removed. A little bit different this time. because in 2019, like the U.S. Embassy, it wasn't until halfway through that paro in October 2019 that they issued a do not travel to Ecuador. The U.S. actually preemptively, before the paro started on the 13th, issued a do not travel to Ecuador notice. So, read into that as you will, right? But we all had an inkling it was going to be a little different this time. And I feel like that's what we're seeing.
A lot of the media I've seen is, well, in the West anyway, is kind of framing it already as an indigenous protest. Now, as you said, it's not just indigenous, but from what I've read, it seems the indigenous people are the worst affected from these issues with the price hikes and the fuel and that. Would you say that's accurate?
I absolutely accurate. And the 10 points are all codified by CONEI. They are the people who called the paro, and other organizations ratified their agreement to join that paro. So they are the figurehead organization leading the negotiations, sticking to their guns about what the points are, and that they will not take quarter half measures towards them, that they really need all of these to be addressed. Are all these things going to be fixed immediately? No. But even when a government response is coming back, they're hardly addressing some of the points. And it allows one individual to make sure that one individual organization, an umbrella organization, to make sure that what everybody has ratified is what is being brought to the negotiation table. But it's really worth noting the bananeros, the banana sector, they've been protesting since March. The university sector has been protesting since April. The transitos have been protesting since last fall. There have been ongoing smaller paros from other sectors, and all of those have kind of unified under this umbrella paro indefinado now, that is being led by CONEI, though is not only representing CONEI. And like with those 10 points, about fair farm prices and stuff, yes, that has an impact on indigenous communities. 83% of the food produced and purchased in Ecuador is actually produced by the campesinos. Is interrelated. Like, even if it is just the banana sector, not a fully indigenous workforce at all, the indigenous points, there's an interchange between all these different organizations, and the points impact not just the indigenous population, though they are the most vulnerable, but also even these other productive sectors as well.
Right. Would you say it's more a youth kind of movement? Would you say that, like, amongst the protests? I know you said it's all different people, but generally I find it's usually the youth that really are out there.
Yeah, the youth are the organizers on the ground. I think the emergency medics and that type of medical brigade is more middle-aged, I think. There are a lot of older, in particular older women who are out as well, mothers with their children. I do think that in terms of who's putting themselves on the actual front lines, it is the majority are younger individuals who are fighting for their future. And you asked earlier about, are there certain parts of those that are protesting that are moving towards violence sooner? I think that that's the demographic that will escalate further more rapidly, partially just because of ability. But they really are the face of a lot of what is happening on the actual ground. They are the photographers and organizers that are out there documenting things as it happens. There are plenty of older people there as well. But in terms of what's showing up in the media, it is predominantly younger Ecuadorians.
Right. And this protester was killed recently by the cops firing this tear gas grenade. What's the response been like there? I imagine that's really kind of, for want of a better word, kind of re-energized the protesters.
Yes, it definitely has. It actually, to be honest, the 14th, 15th, 16th, besides Issa being arrested, like things were actually calming down. Some of the roadblocks would close overnight so that people could get through. But after Byron's death, things really did escalate, and the two, possibly three additional deaths in Quito in the last 36 hours mean that a very, very rapid escalation is imminent further.
What do you think that will look like?
Um, I think that things will continue to be focused in Quito, just as the legislative seat, and because that is where the majority of people have kind of gathered. It's happening in parks and universities. A number of the universities in Quito have opened their doors to protesters to stay indefinitely and to have shelter, but those universities have been breached by the military repeatedly for housing the protesters. It's interesting to note, we talked about the insecurity with the prison riots, right? So the PARO was announced on June 4th. They've been trying to get a law in place to outline the levels for progressive use of force since prison riots started in 2021. They were actually able to get the assembly to pass a law clearly defining the escalating legal use of force on June 7th, 6 days before the protests began, despite equivocating on that for over a year. As of last night, the Minister of the Interior, Patricio Carrillo, said that they will progress now to the use of pellet guns, not just tear gas and rubber bullets. There's actually already been a death associated with the use of pellet guns before that announcement was made. It's almost like once they have been undeniably caught using an escalating level of force, they then say that we've reached this level, but only after someone has died as a result of the use of those munitions. So they said yesterday that we're going to this next level, and Lasso made a very thinly veiled threat that said, "Oh, it's frustrating." He said yesterday that if the indigenous people are so concerned for their security, they better go home.
Right. Okay. That's a very, yeah, I was gonna say that's very thinly veiled. And he also was on telly with like he was on the TV with like the Navy and the military, right?
Yes, there have been several times where the armed forces, the military police and the national police have had quote unquote press conferences, but no questions were taken. It was just saying we are progressing to the next level of the legal use of progressive force. Yeah.
And without firearms in the country, obviously I'm not saying like, oh, there should be a war or anything, but you know, just thinking about it, without firearms in the country, it doesn't sound like protesters can do much to combat that. You know what I'm saying? It sounds like it's going to be a bloodbath potentially. I hope not, but you know, it does sound like it's spiraling quite fast, especially like even faster than before the previous times.
100%. And there was resolution by this point with the ones that were so bad in October 2019. So I want to reiterate, where there's a will, there's a way. Like there are civilians that have weapons, but the only live rounds that have been used by civilians have actually been counter protesters at this point. There was a very the state of social media and the world we live in, right? Some TikTokers, kind of upper middle class individuals, attempted to commit vehicular homicide outside of Quito. Were trying to drive into protesters and shooting live rounds at civilians, including women and children. The roads were closed. They had to drive through police blockades to even be able to do what they were doing, and they were able to flee without being arrested or bragged about it on TikTok. People have their cedula numbers and their names. Their TikTok name is their actual given name. Horrible OPSEC, but they aren't even going to be taken into custody. So there are people with weapons.
It's kind of like a death squad then. And I mean, kind of like a self-appointed paramilitary. And if the government haven't prosecuted them, it's kind of endorsed, no?
Exactly.
And who are they? Like far right or what?
So within the context of the political spectrum in Ecuador, Lasso is center right, is what his kind of organization is. He's incredibly socially conservative, very Catholic. Ecuador is an incredibly Catholic country. Yeah. And it's more of a class issue. I think the counter protesters are all upper middle class. There is still, not called as such, but particularly in cities like Cuenca or in Quito, there is a de facto caste system still in place. And so these are the people that are from those upper caste that are serving as counter protesters. There are people that are out. They joke that it's the so there's a one of the common dishes, like the everyman, like a college student, like you only have $1 to eat. People eat salchipapas, so it's basically just like a hot dog split down the middle with potatoes, right? Is what a lot of people eat. So there's the salchipapas class versus what they're calling the Nutella class, the people who shop at the kind of the super moxie, kind of like the Trader Joe's here. There are a lot of these women out with their bleached hair and plastic surgery saying to kill the indigenous people, using slurs. Yeah, I know. But it's really, the counter protesters is a class issue. A communa I really respect made an interesting point yesterday and said, when we protest, we're delinquents, but during elections, we're citizens, right? There's this structural racism and classism that's really feeding the rhetoric around those protesting. But you also have to understand, like, the doctors are out there protesting because they don't have medicine to treat people or a way to train the next generation of doctors. It's not easy to become a doctor. It's expensive anywhere in the world to go through that amount of training. Like, those are not the lowest class people that are the most impoverished that are even out there on protesting. But everybody is being lumped in, saying that they are these terrorists and delinquents, and that their delinquency is linked to their indigenous identity.
It doesn't sound like things are going well. How is the media in Ecuador generally covering these protests?
So I would actually say that it's quite fair. So the two largest newspapers, El Comercio and El Universo, one based in Quito, one based in Guayaquil, they have been covering up to date, very, very, I think, pretty fairly, both the statements and press releases that come out from the protesting side, and also the initial, or the pronouncements that come down from the ministry or the government or from Lasso. They're also digging into the biographies of the individuals who lead these different sub-organizations, providing context. They have been reporting on deaths, trying to frame things the way that they can without libel. Libel laws are very, very, so there's a constitutional right to journalism, but you can be sued for leaving a bad business review. So they have to be very careful in terms of allocating responsibility, assigning responsibility for deaths. But it's not being, when the man fell into the ravine, the young man, it didn't get left out of the media. They just couldn't say it was definitively a cause of this. They're doing the best they can within the legal constraints that they have. There's a lot of, it's the day and age where a lot of coverage is on social media. There are a lot of indigenous-led independent media organizations that are also reporting on things. The coverage is, there's not a lot being omitted, but in terms of actually assigning responsibility or getting to the implications of an action, it isn't getting to that point, even in Spanish currently.
Okay. Is there anything else you think we should really go into now before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I asked some people I respect, if they could tell the English speaking world what's not being said about the paro, kind of, what they would say. A lot of people pointed to some of those figures I've already quoted. The universal basic income is $425 a month. Most people don't get to that point, and it costs $750 a month to live here. There's internal migration issues that are amplifying the issue, not even just external migration, but people moving to big cities and dying en route, trying to cross the Andes during the rainy season to seek job opportunities. 32% of Ecuadorians live on less than $2.80 a day. 15% live on less than $1.80 a day. 47% of the population live on 1 or 2 meals a day at best. So they're out there protesting without even the needed nutrients to keep themselves standing. How much of a threat is somebody that for the last 10 years has been eating 1 meal a day? 7 out of 10 Ecuadorians don't have a stable or decent job. There's a femicide in Ecuador every 42 hours.
Jesus.
Oil spills occur at least twice weekly. That it's not just CONEI, that it's human rights groups, feminist, environmental organizations, all of whom have tried to go to the table separately and have signed on to the protest in solidarity, that more than 300 people have been deprived of the liberty and died in prisons so far this year, not even counting the hundreds last year. And then I'll just leave you with one more. That the indigenous people are in the city, showing their strength and resiliency. Indigenous people in the Campo, do not get enough to eat 1 meal a day, but they are the ones that feed the city. Structural racism has meant that peoples and their cultures here are not being recognized for their value, not only in food sovereignty, but in cultural opportunity. That this is really about the future of Ecuador. This isn't even just about something right now. This is so that those young people who are on the front line have a future. It is people fighting for their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren alongside their grandchildren. That despite how things are being portrayed, the will is with the Raza, with the Pueblo, with the people, and that they're not going to back down no matter what the cost ends up being, that this is too important for them to even. There are so many people willing to sacrifice something for the betterment of their country, and to frame those people as the delinquents is really missing the mark.
I know you want to stay anonymous, but where would you suggest people look to if they want to get informed further on what's going on?
Sure. So on Twitter, the main hashtag is Paro Nacional EC. There's also No Puedo, so El Paro No Para. The Paro will not stop. You can also follow the protesters' official party line with CONAIE, CONAIE. They're on Instagram, they're on Twitter, they have their own website, they regularly release press releases. There are some great indigenous media organizations like WAMBRA, WAMBRA, that follow things. Those are the places that really will be giving the full side of the story. But even if you want to see what the middle ground looks like, those same newspapers, El Comercio and El Universo, all you got to do is open it in Chrome, turn on Translate, you can read it. It doesn't have to be English language coverage to really be able to keep up with things there.
Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
I really appreciate it too. Thank you for taking the time. I know, especially with what's happening yesterday in the US and other things too, that everyone has a lot on their mind, but I think it's really important. I think it's really important for people to at least have an understanding of where this is and where it's been going before it gets worse, because this is going to get worse before it gets better.
No, definitely. I think so as well. And, as bad as the awful situation is in America, the world doesn't revolve around America, despite what a lot of Americans think. So, yeah, we definitely like to, look at what's going on elsewhere. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate that.
No, definitely. We'll be in touch as things progress, hopefully for the better. But either way, we'll be in touch.
Happy to speak with you again, deep dive on anything you want to get into, any of it, and, keep you updated on things as they happen. But thoughts with Ecuador today after the deaths yesterday and the thinly veiled responses from the government in terms of their intention.
That was Francis speaking about the deadly clashes in Ecuador and how they've kind of been misreported in some ways. It's not just about one thing or the other, it's about a lot. Essentially the future of Ecuador for a lot of Ecuadorians. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, please do consider supporting us on the Patreon, patreon.com/Popular Front. That is the main way we make our money. That helps us keep moving forward. Unfortunately, there is a lot of hurdles for us to make money. For example, we just put a brand new documentary out on YouTube, Frontline Hooligan. You've probably heard of it by now. It is a documentary where we spent time with Ukraine's only anti-fascist football hooligan firm that are now fighting Russia on the front lines. We put that documentary out and YouTube immediately age restricted it, so a lot less people will see it. It's completely demonetized. The whole channel is completely demonetized essentially, and they also removed the thanks button. So even if someone wanted to comment and give us like a $5 and say, yeah, good work, they've actually removed that now. So it's fucked up. So the way we can continue to keep moving forward is the patreon.com/Popular Front. There is loads of bonus content there, video content, audio, all sorts, lots of stuff there. Or if you want to send us a one-time donation or something like that, go to popularfront.co/support. As I said, unfortunately, a lot of the main avenues for us to make money have been completely shut down because a lot of these big tech companies only allow advertising on very namby-pamby soft content. We don't do that at Popular Front, we do real life shit, so they've stopped us from making any money from it. It's annoying, it's a struggle, but we're not going to change what we do. Fuck that. Thank you to our sponsors on the podcast. They are Oracle Coffee Shop in Portland, Oregon, USA. They're an independent coffee business selling only fair trade products. See them at 3875 Southwest Bond Avenue 97239. They are also Grind Core House, a pair of independent coffee shops in Philadelphia, USA. One in South, one in West. Find them on socials at Grind Core House. We're also sponsored by Propagandopolis, an outlet selling and writing about historical conflict propaganda from around the world. You can buy prints at propagandopolis.com. Use the promo code PopularFront10 for 10% off. The lad that runs Propagandopolis is actually a friend of ours. We share an office with him. He's just had a baby, so congrats, lad. Really happy to hear everything went well. If you want to follow us on the social medias, Instagram at popular.front, Twitter at popularfront_, and you can follow me anywhere at Jake_Hanrahan. HANRAHAN. The youtube.com/Popular Front. As I said, you'll see our new documentary there, Frontline Hooligan. If you can, please do share it, because YouTube is trying to give us this soft censorship. Instagram is doing the same. I guess the narrative of anti-fascist football hooligans fighting in the war, talking about the neo-Nazis they previously fought. I guess that doesn't really tee up with the agenda for a lot of these tech bros and what have you. Either that, or they just were like, yeah, fuck them. The algorithm said no. I don't know, but it's a fucking pain. But still, it's done like 60,000 views in 3 days, despite being age restricted, which anyone who knows about YouTube will know that an age restriction absolutely torpedoes your views. But it is what it is. You can also find it, the doc, in a much lower quality on the Telegram. I think that's t.me/onlypopularfront. There'll be no age restrictions there, but again, it's not the same watching it on a phone, you know. Yeah, if you can, get a hold of a YouTube account, watch it, share it, whatever. We know a lad that messaged Sam Black, and he was like, I'm in an Indonesian prison, and he was watching it. So if you can find a way, someone can find a way. Yeah, definitely check it out. Music in this episode, the intro was by Home, and the outro, as always, was by Sam Black. Sam Black's music is now slowly being uploaded to all music streaming platforms, also on all social medias. Yeah, if you go to samblackpf.com, you'll see his music, but you can search for it also on Spotify, Apple Music, all of them, Deezer, all of those ones, all the weird ones. Just search for Sam Black PF. We're trying to upload kind of a lot of back catalogs up there, but Ditto and Spotify and all of them just take a long time. It's a pain, but yeah, if you just keep checking back in, follow him on there on the Spotify, and it will keep notifying every time a new EP or whatever, a track is up on there. Yeah, as I said before, please consider supporting us. Patreon.com/popularfront. Thank you very much to the high tier Patreons. They are Claire Hofbauer, Benjamin Topper, Chongus Bongwater, Cameron Collins, Nutty, Q Loves Cake Farts, Nicholas Blomberg, Matthew Diffley, Noah Schmidt, Jane Millerchip, Claire, Liana, Sean, Christianovich, NTHG, Ethan Zwick, Champagne Anarchist, Elise Middlefar, David McManus, Joaquin Williamson Holt, Udoye Travis, Hector K, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Lisa Milgram, Bradley Davies, No Dogs, No Hamsters, Brendan Crave, B, Drift, Pete Hesher, RX, Tiki Lover, Cherry, Ben Marshall, Dallas Dunn, Sikha Gupta, LD50 Seattle, K Glitter Vulcan, Meredith Waters, Bethany Swoveland, Adam H, Ryan Barbadillo, Derivative Fool, and then someone's name is Bolowowa, which is the way Brits like me say bottle of water. Bottle of water. Larson 8669, Karante, Bjorn Kirsten, Diamond Steen, Michael O'Connor, Jack Doherty, Nicholas Butter, JD Jav, Ian Froese, James Cully, Anil Dingus, Tynan Daly, Ethan, Shanklin the Painter, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, Mike Barone, Ben, Scott Hopton, Liam Williams, Chris Cusimano, Degenerate Zero Alpha, Giorgio Arani, DR, Trey Nance, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Nawaiz, Nate Van Dor, Christina Rivetti, Freya Northman, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony Bin, Adam Bergsnyder, JL, Stephen Davila, Dan Dunham, Fletcher, Chad Walker, Diana Gorvanek, Lawrence Abrahams, What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormick, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zumbul. Thank you all so much. Really do appreciate it, especially in times like this where YouTube is just trying to fuck us, basically. Like, we I don't know, man. Like, it's just ridiculous. Taking away the thanks thing is just like, ugh. Like, people can't even donate their own money for the doc's sake of it, you know? Nightmare. Anyway, thank you all for supporting. Support us, patreon.com/popularfront. you.